Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me and my companion panelists and wish all this conference all the success. And I hope it builds on the previous success it has achieved in previous years. We may be the second panel following last night's discussion, but we are the first at this place in which we hope we will try to provide an overview of the region and the affecting factors and players and how Iraqi players, regional players, should foresee the dynamic and the changes taking place. What are the real powers? What are expected powers to come? And what are the sort of areas which we may have thought no longer exist but re-emerge, or new areas which we were not aware of and more or less came over sudden. Let me first introduce my panelists. Start with Steve. Steve is the Iraqi director at State Department. He's come over from the United States to maybe get a sight of what's going on over the last post-Iraqi election and also make us aware what is the US direction moving forward. Then we have our old friend, dear friend Randa from Middle East Institute, a Washington institute whom focused on the MENA region in general, and her energy and drive to project what's going on to the world from a Middle Eastern perspective is highly appreciated of. And finally, we have my old friend Vali Nasr, a well-known scholar, distinguished professor, previous State Department, wasn't it? And well-known in Iraq, well-known in the Shia world, and well-known as a commentator. He has not been to Iraq for a while. Now he's just been here for a few days, and I hope we will get some sight of how he sees the dynamics in this country and the region. I was given the task of maybe a few minutes just to give an overview of what's going on in our region, and then thereafter pose questions to each of my companions. Maybe they have 5 minutes to give an answer, and then another round of questions, and then we'll open up to the panel. We have just over 1 hour, and I hope that the short answers, certainly short questions, will make us, maybe give us a crash course on the power dynamics and the power alignment taking place. So welcome again, and I hope we will start now. Well, people in the Middle East are not surprised to changes. People from outside who view Middle East are not surprised to changes. This is a region in the world where there are so many epicenters, where there is religious, sectarian, petroleum or energy, and civilizations take place, inter-civilizations, clashes, and dialogues also take place. So to that effect, I think people are not surprised. In project management term, you may call it a work in progress case all the time, where things keep changing. And with last maybe 20 years, or maybe post 9/11, we have had major shift in the region, Arab Springs. Over the last few years, we have what people call Shia Springs. And in between, we have had major turmoil, major changes, demographic changes, geopolitical changes, countries became non-state actors having a role, countries going through turmoil, economical, social, political, and so on. So change or threat factors or opportunity factors are always in our region. To call it dynamic is an understatement. To call it volatile may be a bit too much. And we are in between. In the midst of all this, we have a global change taking place, in which we start with a bipolar, then we move into a unipolar. Now we may be seeing the first signs of a multipolar globe. Those forces They may have dependencies or interdependencies between them, such as China and the United States, have areas of interest, including our region. Geography stipulates its own forces. Need of other countries to the region stipulates its own forces. Threats from the region, which is migration or terrorism, demographic changes, interest of countries for Israeli security, for example, and so on, keeps this region at the forefront of news, and countries, foreign services, intelligence services, trying to figure out what's taking place and what will take place. So this is just a very quick overview of what we mean when we talk about power dynamics and power alignments. Certainly, there might be a more increased confusion, maybe a strong word, but ambiguity as to the type of alignment to expect in the next few years and decades. So to that effect, who do we want to start with, Stephen or Vali? Vali, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Delaware and also MERI for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be in Erbil for the first time. I mean, you've raised some very important and big questions, and maybe putting it in a context we're in a very interesting time period for this part of the world. At one level, it looks like some of the big conflicts of the past, particularly the latest one, over the rise of Daesh and the threat of terrorism has been contained. But the Middle East, I think, is being impacted majorly by bigger changes that are happening around the world. I think in the time period we're in, it's not just that the world is going from a unipolar to a multipolar environment, but actually that the largest, most important conflicts in the world are not for the first time happening in the Middle East, but are happening somewhere else. So it's the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, and then broader Europe and the US, and it's the prospect of a conflictual relationship between US and China, and potentially, at least the way that many in the West think, that a showdown over Taiwan may happen sooner than later. So Middle East conflicts right now are for the first time not top of mind in the West, but in fact it's very interestingly that the Middle East is playing much more of a balancing role in these conflicts. For instance, we see Iran's intervention in Ukraine has had an impact on the war, or Saudi Arabia's decision to side with Russia over price of oil in OPEC Plus has had a big impact. So Middle East is not outside of these conflicts, but it's not the center of these conflicts, and that's important to note. Secondly, it is inevitable, regardless of what Washington says, for people in this region not to think that the Middle East is no longer the pivot of US foreign policy. It's not the number one agenda around which US foreign policy is organized, and that the lion's share of American military diplomatic resources are being dedicated elsewhere. That does not mean that the United States is going to leave the region. It's not between black and white, but that the nature of its involvement, commitment, role in problem solving, etc., is going to shift drastically. And I think the most immediate impact of this is that everybody in the region has started to recalibrate and sort of understand what the new chessboard is. Countries that previously refused to talk to each other are now exchanging ambassadors. For instance, UAE, despite all of its conflicts with Iran, going back just to a year or two ago over tankers, etc., has sent its ambassador back to Tehran, as has Kuwait. Saudi Arabia and Iran had been talking at least until Iraqi elections under the aegis of the Iraqi government. And Turkey and the Gulf countries have mended fences. So there's a lot of, if you would, jockeying of position. This does not mean that love is in the air in the region. It means that without the United States dictating or providing a certain framework, that countries are basically pursuing their interests differently, which makes a very complicated situation. And a lot of these deals are not necessarily above the water. Some of them are opaque. Some of them are not quite understandable in the West as to where it's coming. And then you could add the fact that China and Russia are also much more involved in these sort of three-dimensional game of chess more than they were a decade before. We do have in this region, below this level, an intense regional power rivalry, which is perhaps new. In other words, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, in various ways are competing for influence, particularly in countries that are weaker in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, etc. In some places they cooperate, in some places they don't. There are some surprises, like Lebanon and Israel arriving at an agreement over maritime borders, which would not have happened without, I think, Iran's approval. At the same time as, relations between Iran and Israel have been getting worse and worse. Now, understanding where this goes is important. It's important for instance, a country like Iraq, which very quickly can become the vortex of this kind of a regional conflict, especially if you have a lesser U.S. direct involvement in this country or in the region, as was the case before. And finally, particularly the case of Iran is important because it has occupied such an important part of political imagination in Washington and political imagination in this region. There's no way in which to sort of not say that it is very critical about where this region might go. Understanding things right now with Iran is complicated, and we can come back to it, but I would say that U.S.-Iran relations, at least since 2011, has been sort of spiraling in the lower direction, then getting it plateaued around negotiations over a nuclear deal with Iran, and then since 2018 they've been spiraling downwards. Over the past year there has been hope that they would arrive at a deal and that would provide certain floor of stability, but that floor is right now not there because the deal was not signed. It doesn't look like it's being signed. If we listen to the U.S. Special Envoy for these nuclear talks, Robert Malley, saying that literally they don't see a deal in the future and they're not even going to pursue an aggressive path to it. And then you have Iran's involvement in Ukraine. There's some degree of tit for tat with Israel and in Ukraine, and the Ukraine issue is an added issue. And then the protests in Iran have obviously clouded the West's vision about how they should approach Iran at this particular point in time. So you add these three things together, and then you would say we're also entering a black box in terms of where U.S.-Iran relations would go, Iran-Saudi relations would go. And so I think it's interesting to watch this, but I think Middle East is sort of operating, or a country like Iraq is operating in a completely new environment that nobody can basically say exactly how it would pan out.
Thank you. Linda.
First, thank you very much. Thank you, Middle East Research Institute, Dr. Dlauer, for the invitation. Thank you, Lukman. And pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleagues. I'm going to build on what Vali has said, in that for the first time in 2 decades, the region, MENA regions, is political and security and economic trajectory is being impacted by a conflict outside its geographical territory. And it has impacted the region through mostly right now economic and security issues, as the region, especially non-oil and gas producing countries, are feeling the shocks in terms of food security, in terms of energy security. But at the same time, the other impact on the region, because of the war in Ukraine, is the hardening of global geopolitical fault lines, namely between the West and Russia, which has given the region a pause as it attempts to carefully balance relationships with both sides. You have asked us in the title of this panel to crystal gaze at developments in the Middle East, and I will talk about 3 trends that I see are here and they are staying with us, and they might evolve in the future. The first trend, which again Vali alluded to, is that the priority focus throughout the MENA region now and in the near future will remain on the economic, energy and climate agenda, with the MENA region expected to face continuing shocks in this realm. Now, how big these shocks to the region, especially the economic ones, are going to be, and how long they will last, will be determined primarily by the duration of the Ukraine war and the sanctions imposed on Russia. Now, during this period, there are winners and losers. The winners are the oil and gas producing countries, which, according to the IMF, GCC, Central Asian oil and gas producing countries, are expected to have a windfall in the next 4 years of about $1 trillion from higher energy prices. And the GCC countries are likely to even benefit even more than countries in Central Asia that are oil and gas exporting, because they are going to be saving more. The GCC countries are expected to save about 1/3 of this cumulative windfall from. And there are the poorer countries, the losers, but they are not necessarily, smaller countries. Egypt, for example, which is experiencing now major economic shocks, food crisis, energy crisis, countries that already have difficulties with governance, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan. So the expectation going forward is that you are going to have these winners who are going to, that are going to benefit a lot from the higher energy crisis to assist these poorer countries in their neighborhood. The question is going to be not whether they will, because I think they will, the question is how. The old patterns of Saudi, Kuwaiti, Emirati assistance in the region is to throw money at it. We saw that in 2013 in Egypt, when you have Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE throwing $35 billion to help Egypt with its fiscal crisis after the ouster of President Morsi and the coup by President Sisi. Today, what we are seeing is a different pattern of engagement. Last week, Saudi Crown Prince, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced the formation of 5 regional companies with worth of $24 billion that are going to invest in 6 countries in the region, in real estate developments, in telecommunications, in infrastructure developments. And Iraq is one of these countries. So it's Iraq, Oman, Jordan, Bahrain, Egypt. And this is the pattern that you are going to see. And it is a pattern that basically shifts us away within the region from what used to be a decade of war, confrontation, instability that started with the Arab Spring War into a decade more of regional integration, of cross-border trade, of economic coordination. Which brings me to my second trend, which is, my computer died on me, sorry. The second trend is what also Vali talked about, which is a combination of a deprioritization of the MENA region by the United States that has been in the making since the Obama administration. And I use the word carefully. Deprioritization, not exit, not retreat, not withdrawal. Deprioritization of the MENA region, colliding with a new regional alignment that is driving a diversification in the relationship within the region and beyond. Vali alluded already to the rapprochement, the broad détente between Arab countries, Arab Gulf countries, Iran, Turkey, Israel after the Abraham Accords. I think we're going to see more of that happening. Now, the wild card here is going to be what happens in Iran. There are definitely serious uprisings that express a deep break in Iranian society between the regime and a big segment of the Iranian population, primarily youth. What happens, how the regime is going to deal with it is still unfolding. We don't know in terms of response. But I think it will have implication on this spirit of de-escalation and détente in the region, because it can go either way. It can either lead to some change, not regime change, but rather to some deprioritization of their international affairs, of their regional intervention, focus more on domestic issues, bringing to the fore reform-minded leaders, or it can lead to a more activist foreign policy, more intervention in the region. It can go either way, partly to deflect attention from what's happening. So I think what happens next in Iran is going to have major implication on this broad détente and rapprochement that we are seeing evolving in the region. In terms of the United States, again, internationally, traditional alignment with Washington as far as the region is concerned is no longer the de facto policy position. There is a drive among regional countries, especially Gulf Arab countries, for diversification in relationships with other powers, including Russia and China. But part of the region's calculations with the Ukraine war, its relationship with Russia and regional rapprochement, is, in my opinion, a hedging process against the current US administration and a wider expectation that the Democratic Party will lose power starting with the midterm elections in November 22, followed by the presidential election in 2024. Again, the attitude toward Russia might also shift as countries in the region, especially oil and gas producing countries, start accommodating to a new normal that sees a reduction in Russia's role as a commodities player in global markets. Finally, despite within this context, there remains areas for cooperation, but also areas for competition and confrontation. We still have failed states. We still have, whether we call it fragile, failed, we still have Syria. We still have the problem brewing in Syria. We still have major problems in Iraq. We still have a country in Lebanon that is on the brink of total collapse. I mean, we still have a major refugee crisis. Countries in the region are still suffering from governance issues that have not left them since the Arab Spring. And these are going to continue with us and are going to create challenges to countries, especially as they are dealing with the economic shocks of the Ukraine war. But also, as Vali has noted, there is an area for cooperation. And I think this maritime border agreement, which was struck recently between Lebanon and Israel, provides a template for conflict resolution in the region that is transactional, issue-specific, win-win, with the mediation of the United States. So I think what's happening is that both the United States and the region are going to issue grand designs in terms of conflict resolution and solving issues and focus on specific issues which can lend themselves to win-win approach, can serve US national interests, but at the same time can serve the interests of the region.
Thank you. Stephen, is the US reducing its footprint in the region?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak today at the MERI Forum. Dr. Al-Adain, for the distinguished panelists. Very interesting comments made so far. Interested to see the discussion as the panel continues. I want to structure my initial comments today within the framework of the President's National Security Strategy, which he released on October 12th. His strategy reaffirmed what the administration has made clear from the beginning, that the United States remains deeply committed to the Middle East, and we have enduring interests here. We remain, as we always have been, focused on regional peace, stability, and prosperity, and to developing our deep and strategic partnerships with countries across the Middle East. President Biden said from the earliest days of his administration that the world is at an inflection point, and the choices we make today will set the terms of how we respond to the challenges and the opportunities we face in the future. These challenges drive our global agenda and also inform our policies here in the region. These include Russia's, as has been commented, Russia's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, China's designs to reshape the international order, and the existential threat of climate change. We can really only tackle these challenges working together as partners. The states that will be best equipped to meet the challenges of our changing world, like COVID-19 and climate change, will be those with resilient governments. That resilience, from our perspective, comes in large part from being inclusive, treating civil society as a partner rather than a threat, respecting human rights and the fundamental freedoms of all people, and building and maintaining the trust of citizens. That's why the United States will not waver from promoting these values, promoting democracy, and promoting the institutions that provide rule of law and good governance. And such governments are best positioned to address the challenges of our time. Climate change is affecting all of us. It's besieged the Middle East, perhaps nowhere more so than here in Iraq. Food insecurity, high temperatures, severe water shortages are all having devastating impacts on societies and economies. With COP27 opening up soon in Egypt, and then next year's COP in the UAE, we have a unique moment to launch a new era of climate-smart initiatives in which the Middle East can take a leadership role in the world's energy transition. No solution to the climate crisis will be sustainable without the participation of the region's critical energy-producing states. We want them, we need these states to be partners in the new geopolitics of energy security and clean energy. We can also build strong partnerships through regional integration. Our support for our partners is amplified when our partners work together towards a common goal. And everything we do, our diplomacy is based on partnership and respect for each other's interests. We do not expect to share the same worldview or assess each challenge in the same way, but we are committed to working with our partners, with you, to advance our shared interests. We also remain committed to our military partnerships in the region. Our military posture is evolving to focus on deterrence, strengthening partner capacity, countering terrorist threats, and ensuring the free flow of commerce. We will not use our military to change regimes or remake societies, but instead limit the use of force to protecting our mutual interests and enabling our partners to defend their territory from external and terrorist threats. This change is good for us, for the United States, and it's better for the region as it supports regional and national stability. Meanwhile, we see in Iran, the Iranian government is sowing instability across the region. And as the world has seen and has commented on, is brutally suppressing the rights of the Iranian people. We remain committed to supporting the Iranian people's demands for human rights and basic dignity, to countering the threat from Iran, and to ensuring Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. We remain alert to the range of threats from Iran. Of course, Iran is not the only malign actor that threatens the international order and contributes to instability. In violation of UN Charter principles on sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states, Russia is waging an unlawful and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, attacking civilians, making reckless nuclear threats. Against such a threat, partnerships matter. We applaud Iraq for their October 12th vote at the UN to condemn Russia's illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory. It's important for countries like Iraq and other responsible members of the international community to stand up against Russia's war. We're also concerned about the deepening Russia-Iran alliance that others have commented on, as we see the evidence right now of the delivery of Iranian UAVs that Russia has used to damage and destroy civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. In that spirit, let me also briefly address the implications of our competition with China here in the region. We do not expect every country to have the exact same assessment of China as we do. Our competition with China is not about a new Cold War. It's not about dividing the world into ideological blocks or forcing countries to choose between the United States or China. It is about upholding an international order that ensures security, fairness, and transparency in the competition for ideas and commercial interests. The alternative offered by China asks countries to submit to opaque investment that leaves them in debt, stokes corruption, harms the environment, fails to create local jobs or growth, and can compromise countries' exercise of their sovereignty. Iraq is very much at the center of these issues and of the President's vision for the region. As a member of the GCC+3, Iraq is contributing to essential coordination and decision-making in the region. The recent conclusion of the GCCIA interconnection deal and the steps Iraq and Jordan have taken to connect their electricity grids is one example. These projects reflect a commitment from Iraq's neighbors for continued engagement and support. We encourage Prime Minister Soudani to build on his predecessor's efforts to continue to integrate Iraq into the region, which will ultimately enhance its economic growth, help its environment, and facilitate further cooperation. We believe this interdependence can form the foundation of a lasting peace. As President Biden said at the GCC+3 summit in Jeddah in July, we will not walk away from the Middle East and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. America's interests are interwoven with successes of the Middle East. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you all for your introduction, for complementing each other in the points and trying to provide us with a more richer view, each from their own perspective. Let me start with Vali. I want to pick your brain on two topics. U.S. priorities moving forward and the position of Iran in the midst of this. as an example, is JCPOA relevant, for example? Do the pieces of the jigsaw, if you want to put them together, do we have a picture as to how to go back these pieces together, or do you think people are trial and error going on, primarily from the Iranian with the changes it faces, such as what took place of post-Ukraine and over the last few weeks and the event inside Iran, or from the US, how it wants to view? It doesn't want to pull out, it doesn't want to be re-engaged, interwoven, where Stephen used. How do you think this can fit with your own post-20 years experience, at least in trying to project US influence and how it can work or not?
Well, thank you. I mean, to the call of crystal gazing, yes. I will do that. I think, largely the United States has at least given up on the idea that it will proactively try to shape the direction of things in the region.
Given up.
Right. I mean, either the war in Ukraine.
Stephen heard that word, giving up.
No, I mean, I can say this is my impression. I cannot say necessarily. I don't speak for the U.S. government, but okay. The reality of it is that as an outside observer, you look at it and you say, let's take a five-year time framework at least. That either the war in Ukraine will get worse, and also we end up with a much bigger set of conflicts with China over Taiwan, etc., in which case the trend line that we identified, namely that the US would have too much on its plate to shape the future of the Middle East in a proactive way, will actually, would hold. In other words, the US will not have time or energy or necessarily the desire to proactively try to shape where this region goes, or have a theory of what the region should look like down the road. On the other hand, if the war in Ukraine winds down or arrives at a much lower level, likely the United States will go back to what, as Randa said, started with President Obama, which is this pivot to Asia, the longer game of trying to contain and manage China, which again says that for the United States, it's not going to be, the idea of forming the future of the Middle East is not top of mind. Secondly, I would say the United States has not really been very successful in the Middle East when it has had big projects like we're going to bring democracy to the region, or we're going to create liberal Islam. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan loom very large in the minds of American public, not as success stories, but actually as cautionary tales of overreach in that sense. So I think the US will engage where it must. It will be supportive of positive developments. It will try to influence the region, but it also is likely to have a much more conflictual relationship even with allies over Russia and China. I mean, the public spat with Saudi Arabia over the price of oil, and the fact that the perception is Saudi Arabia sided with Russia, regardless of how you sugarcoat it, and whatever reasons you bring up, is suggesting of a very different kind of a US-Saudi relationship or confrontation in a war at a time which is the most important thing for the United States. So Saudi Arabia made a decision that it's not going to support the United States the way it did in previous wars as far away as Nicaragua or elsewhere. And so those are also going to be sets of issues. The US is going to have its hands full dealing with UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt when it comes to China and Chinese investments in infrastructure and trade and the like. And I think it's an ongoing dynamic. The more the region is convinced that the United States is not 100% focused on its security and on its support, the more it's likely to plot its own way forward. I mean, in some ways, Saudi Arabia is not different from Germany or Japan, who have doubts about US security commitment. Okay. I mean, I would just say, Abqaiq, for instance, is a cautionary lesson. The US made a decision not to militarily respond to Iran, and that's a lesson for Saudi Arabia, that it has to manage its own relations with Iran in a way that would avoid a next Abqaiq, for instance. And then finally, I would say about Iran very quickly, I do see dangers there. Yes, JCPOA may be dead as a particular deal, but the problem that JCPOA was going to address is still on the table, and it could get much more dangerous. Iran's nuclear program is still there. They are very close to a threshold. They may cross the threshold. The question is hanging. What would Israel do about it? What would the United States do about it? What does it take to get the Iranians not to get to that point in time? What will Iran look like when it becomes a threshold state? Right? We cannot hang our hat on the fact that protesters in the streets of Tehran are going to take over the government. They could destabilize, they could change the direction of the government, as Randa said. But this issue of JCPOA is still there. And I think on the other side, I would say that whereas the world looks at Iran today and sees this as about a human rights, women's rights issue, I would venture to say that Iran probably sees this as a concerted effort at regime change. As you can see, the reaction
but there is a clear U.S. statement: we are not into regime change.
Well, what you say and with the way that it's interpreted is different. You could even read what Rob Malley said yesterday, saying we're not interested in the nuclear deal anymore. We're going to do things where we're useful, like supporting the protesters. If you're in Tehran, you would see that, like JCPOA is on the back burner, supporting the protesters in the front burner. I mean, Iranian actions like attacking KRG with missiles and bases here, viewing this as a sort of an ethnic threat. So you also have an Iran that is also in a siege mentality, I think, seeing that it's being attacked, and therefore the issues that Randa says about what the young population want and addressing these issues is in a greater context. And the region. And I think the region is only learning how to interact with one another in a way to manage its own issues. But it doesn't have really any mechanisms of doing so.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one small point to add or to take away from what you said in a way is if there is a regime change or not, how Iran will react to it, that's one side. How do players in the region interpret that? And more importantly, what's the end objective of the demonstrations inside Iran? Is it reform or regime change? I think that will have a higher dependency internal. As we may have gathered, whenever external countries talk about another, until the inner dynamics of that country works out in either direction, then you would know what's the real effect, rather than us crystal gazing. Randa, let me give you this question in a different framework. We have three countries: China, Russia, and US. We have three entities in the region. Lebanon is your specialty, so if you don't mind me, I'll pick your brain on that. We have the GCC countries, and we talked about that. And we have the North African countries with their own region. So we have those three sides. Finally, we have a relationship which is independent, interdependent, and dependent relationship. In the midst of all this, do you see that we're moving into a new world order, or do you think the jury is still out way too early to even understand what will take place over the next decade or so?
I think the jury is still out, and primarily the Ukrainian war. I mean, if you ask me this question about a year ago, I would say yes, we are moving. I mean, when you travel around the region and talk with officials, the perception here definitely is that we are moving on, we cannot rely only on the Americans. I think of all, the inflection point in their perception about the reliance of the U.S. security umbrella was in 2019, the attack on Abqaiq.
Attack of?
Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I think when the Trump administration, which was seen by most Gulf countries as being one of the friendliest, most supportive, at least in rhetoric, to their interests, refrained from engaging in the kind of reaction that they expected in response to this attack from Iran on major oil installations that affect the energy flow throughout the region. I think the lesson taken, and I could see that because when with the Obama administration, you started talking with people in the region, with officials, there is a shift. There is a shift going on in the US. It is truly a pivot. It's still in its beginning. It did not register. With Trump, in fact, the hope was this was going to be reversed. And I kept saying, the metaphor we had to look at is like US policies are like a big battlefield. Once they move in one direction, it's very hard to reverse that direction, to make a detour. And then the Abqaiq attacks made them convinced of that. And in my opinion, that was the inflection point when countries in the region started reaching out to Iran, trying to, de-escalate tension. After that, we started seeing, attempts at COVID diplomacy between UAE and Tehran. Eventually, we started, the dialogue in Baghdad between Saudi and Iran. So that's where. However, what's happening now today between the Ukraine and in Iran have different impact. I think the Ukraine war is unlikely to shift that rapprochement or to affect it much. Even the stalled JCPOA will not. I think this is a decision that is made by these countries that it's in our interest to take matters in our own hands. We are still far away from thinking about a regional security architecture and all of this. We are not even there. We are still at the early step of confidence building and trying to basically figure each other out, especially, Gulf countries, Turkey, Gulf countries, Iran, Gulf countries, Israel. But Russia, as I said, the attitudes right now are very much part of this diversification. But again, what happens in Ukraine is going to impact their assessment. So far, it has not. But as the new normal of what Russia's role is internationally as well as in the region, I think is going to have an impact in shifting maybe their posture. China is a totally different matter. I think they see China as a player that is here to stay, that is going to be investing, that's going to be playing a major role in the region. We have the Chinese president coming soon to Saudi Arabia, for a visit, and they see it again. The Chinese-U.S. competition affecting the prism, the lens through which they look at China's role in the region, but definitely they see it as a big player in the region and as some, as part of their diversification strategy. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's the context.
You did. Thank you. Stephen, as an ex-ambassador in Washington, I need to take it easy with you in one way. As the ex-ambassador in Washington, I need to take it easy with you. But my colleagues raised a few core questions as to the U.S. commitment versus not, reliability on its partners versus not, and moving ahead, could you articulate a Biden doctrine on our region as much as Obama was clear with latter days? I'm not sure whether Trump did have one, but in that sense, in the midst of what you just heard today, I will ask you later when we have Q&A on Iraq specifically, and then also Vali as well on one specific, and Linda on Lebanon, maybe to give us more insight into that. But in a great picture, are the pieces of the jigsaw clear to you? And do you have a clarity of that picture in which you can put and pull these pieces of the jigsaw so that you have a new, redefined, more reliable, more stable, predictable, so that you have less footprint in a safe manner?
It's a big topic.
We are talking crystallizing.
But I would say that the grand strategy, the grand approach of the administration, it is encapsulated in the national security strategy that the president released October 12th.
But it doesn't mention Iraq or the region
it mentions the region.
So that's a statement.
The countries that have.
Yeah, that's a statement on its own, Stephen.
Sure. The countries that are mentioned by name are Russia, China, and Iran a lot. I'm not sure you want Iraq to be mentioned by name a lot in the national security strategy.
As a partner, it should. No?
But I would say, partnerships is what matter to the United States. And I think that that's something that comes through in the national security strategy. That's, I think, part of our approach, not just here in this region, but around the world. But we can't do everything on our own. We need partnerships. We need partners that want to support the international order that has been constructed since the end of World War II, that's brought so much prosperity and stability to so many countries throughout the world. And I think it's a proactive, you can view the U.S. policy as being a proactive agenda, including here in the Middle East. I mean, there are many issues that have been talked about over the last few minutes that many challenges that exist in this part of the world, there are also plenty of opportunities. And I think the climate change I mentioned in my remarks, I think it's one of those issues that the Middle East really needs to play a leading role on. Countries here in the Middle East are more affected by climate change than in most other parts of the world. You see that in Iraq right now. And so working proactively with the United States and integrated with other countries in the region, that's the way that we're going to be able to tackle some of these problems. It's one where the United States we're happy to play a part, happy to work with partners on these issues, but it's going to take.
How predictable are your partners?
I'm sorry.
How predictable are your partners?
It's really hard to hear from this side of the.
How predictable are your partners?
The more predictable, the better, obviously. And that's on our side, the United States. I think that's something that's also come up in several remarks, and how predictable is the United States to our partners. Predictability matters. I think you see in this administration, and I can only speak for the administration that we have right now. I would say that this administration has made clear, and very clear, that we are going to be there for our partners. You can see that in what we're doing, I think, in Ukraine, and in order to defend what we view as our national interest and our shared interest that we have with so many other countries, to stand up against that blatant aggression.
Thank you. You want to
what Steve has said,
complete the picture?
I think it's very important also to realize that the polarization on the domestic front inside the United States, our own domestic politics, are really affecting how reliable we are perceived in the region by our partners in the region.
So could we then, as a result, say that the November election is a factor which may change the direction?
I think, as I said, part of this diversification, there is a bet now in many countries in the region that the Democrats are going to lose next month already. Yeah, we are next month. Yeah, this month. And then that this loss is going to basically translate eventually into a loss of the Democrats in 2024 in the presidential elections. But beyond just party politics, I think this whole atmosphere of polarization, divisiveness in the U.S., which is increasing, is really affecting our perception by countries in the region and our reliability.
Okay.
On the U.S. side, it's in the national security strategy. If you haven't read it, please do.
It's a very good strategy.
It's a good strategy, and it confronts some of these issues head on, in noting the fact that the U.S. is more polarized now than it has been in the past, and that we don't shy away from acknowledging that.
Yes.
We acknowledge the fact that we have struggles. That's okay. The democracy has challenges. We have disagreements internally, and you do what you can to safeguard the institutions so that those disagreements, those policy disagreements, other disagreements, are able to sort themselves out peacefully. There's not an easy answer to say this is what's going to be.
We were given the task of 2 rounds of discussions, but I will cut it, and Kate, to give an opportunity for the next 20 minutes. To Q&A. Anybody has questions specifically, please make it short. And if you have the panel person you want to ask, please make those questions. And it needs to be relevant to the topics we discussed, not something which is an outlier. Questions?
Bayan, there and here.
Okay.
Bayan.
Lady there, please. Is it?
Hello,
Abdurrahman.
Good morning. I'm Bayan Sami Abdurrahman. I'm the KRG representative to the United States. I'd like to thank MERI and Kag Dilawar for hosting this and a very excellent discussion. None of you mentioned Kurdistan. Please, can you crystal gaze on Kurdistan? What is Kurdistan's role in the Middle East dynamics? Thank you.
Okay, so
This is yours.
I think we can get a formal U.S. answer and an informal answer from my lady friend. Please.
Yeah, the Iraqi Kurdistan region is a great partner of the United States. It's our relationship with the Kurdish region goes back many decades. I think, of course, that's speaking about the past, crystal gazing in the future. I think that we look to have a productive and a multifaceted partnership with the Kurdish region. We want to see more U.S. companies doing business here. We want to see more interconnections between people-to-people connections taking place. It's, for me, I would say pretty easy to visit the Kurdish region. I was able to fly in here via Doha last night, and that kind of connectivity, that kind of easy communication will help build those ties. I think that going forward, we want to see a Kurdish regional government that protects human rights, that protects the freedom of journalism, that does all those things that we want to see in our democratic partners around the world.
Okay. Randa, do you want to tell me about the Kurdish part of the jigsaw?
I mean, I'm an old and big friend of Kurdistan, and I've always looked at it as this model for the region where we can experiment with, show the rest of the region tolerance, inclusivity, respect for human rights, better governance. And I had very high hopes in the KRG, always had, especially the talents and the people in the KRG. But to be very honest, I have serious concerns about corruption, about respect for freedom, human expression, freedom of expression, human rights. And I think this is more and more occupying a big space of the narrative in the U.S., in
Are
the West,
players
about
in the region
KRG.
preoccupied with their own issues and therefore they may not support or otherwise the Kurdish case?
I don't.
Are players in the region preoccupied with their own issues and therefore they may not even be able to focus on the Kurdish cases?
I think, look, no, I think there is definitely a focus, but I think it's also, it's very much what the KRG is going to do about its own problems, going forward. And there are high expectations of what they can do about these governance issues. And I think there is a spotlight on the KRG about this, but at the same time, it's definitely a partner. It definitely has shown its readiness to deal with refugee issues plaguing the region and being, host to many of the refugees, especially from the Syrian war.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please. Could you bring a microphone here, please? ارفع ايدك عفوا حتى اشوف. This side. First speaker, please. Yeah. We had a Kurdish question. I'm sure we'll have a Shia question now. This gentleman.
شكرا جزيلا. عامري مدير المعهد العراقي للحوار. السؤال هو للسيد ستيفي وكذلك.
I'll translate question. Okay.
أعتقد أن الاستراتيجية الأمريكية الأخيرة التي أعلن عنها السيد بايدن عادة ما تكون الاستراتيجية الأمريكية استراتيجية عالمية ويعني تدخلية أكثر منها استراتيجية داخلية. والاستراتيجية العالمية يفترض أن تركز على قضايا عالمية بالرغم من أنها استراتيجية لدولة باسم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. السؤال هنالك متغيران مهمان في العالم هو الطاقة وأمن الطاقة والتغيرات المناخية. لم نجد هنالك تفصيل بحجم التفصيل الذي ذكر في الاستراتيجية الأمريكية حول لنقل التنافس الأمريكي الروسي أو التنافس الأمريكي الصيني بجملة أخف. ولكن ألا تعتقدون أن هنالك خللا في صناعة الاستراتيجية الأمريكية في التعامل مع قضايا عالمية مثل التغير المناخي وخطورته وتأثيراته على الصراعات وتأثيراته على الموارد الأولية وغيرها وكذلك على خلق علاقات مضطربة بين الدول الأخرى؟ شكرا.
The question is his review of the U.S. strategy document. It's big, it focuses on external relationship, However, it might be short of two important factors, which is the environmental factors and the effect on that, and also the energy security. Do you not think these are two important factors rather than just focusing on the Chinese and other factors? Within that context, where does your priority and your strategy lies on these two specific issues, environmental and energy security?
Within the national security strategy.
I don't recall offhand. I have the national security strategy here. I could pull it open and read from it, but I believe that it does have elements in there separate from the regional elements about climate specifically. And the need to, I think it encapsulates the energy security aspect of that into the climate portion of the strategy. But it's definitely something that you can see from the president's remarks, all of the remarks of the senior-most U.S. officials, is that climate is a cornerstone of U.S. policy, both domestic and foreign.
Okay, thank you. Question?
مرحبا.
مرحبا.
عمار سرحان من البصرة، خريج زمالة قادة العراق ورئيس منظمة بصريات الثقافة الفيدرالية من دعاة تطبيق الفيدرالية بالعراق. سؤالي للخارجية الأمريكية، يعني أنتم أسقطتم النظام السابق وجئتوا بنظام جديد، نظام يعزز الديمقراطية، ولكن لم تتابعوا تطبيق الدستور. يعني الدستور العراقي أخذ من النظام السابق قوانين عدة مركزية مقيتة، وهذا النظام أنتج مع الدستور العراقي اللامركزي نظام مشوه، لا هو لا مركزي بالمحافظات ولا هو لا مركزي، فأنتج نظام مشوه. سؤالي لماذا لم تتابعون تطبيق الدستور العراقي؟ ونحن بالبصرة طالبنا ب 2015 جمعنا توقيع حسب المفوضية، ولم تطبق الحكومة العراقية بإعطاء الأموال إلى المفوضية.
شكرا.
وكذلك بديالة وصلاح الدين طالبوا السنة بتطبيق الفيدرالي.
سؤال واضح. شكرا. شكرا. The question to you, Stephen, as a U.S. representative here, primarily that you were engaged heavily in the development of Iraq post-2003 and the issues of constitutional implementation of the constitution, following up on it and so on was one of your primary responsibilities. And his perception is that you have not followed up on that and you have more or less abandoned Iraq in the sense of the constitutional element at least. So what are you going to do about it?
Thank you for the question and the concern. I would say that I would disagree with the premise that we have abandoned our relationship with Iraq.
He's a human rights civil activist, by the way.
Okay.
This is where he's coming from.
Insofar as it relates to the implementation of the Iraqi constitution, I think that there's, since I've been in my position at the State Department for the last 5 months, I've had many conversations with Iraqis who have been coming through Washington, talking to me about the challenges that they face, both civil society activists specifically, and I know that the conversations about the Iraqi constitution and the rights that it gives to its citizens, those are conversations that the U.S. Continues to have with Iraqi officials, many times in private settings. So I will say that our commitment to our relationship with Iraq is firm.
Do you have observations, questions, doubts about the implementation of the constitution in Iraq, hence his question? Or do you think that this is a non-existence issue to start with?
Yeah, I'll say that I'll leave the final answer to that question to our ambassador who's going to be speaking here tomorrow. But I will say that we have a multifaceted relationship with Iraq. And we'll continue to work together in partnership with Iraqi government and Iraqi civil society and people in order to continue to improve the situation for all Iraqis.
Thank you, Stephen. Question, gentlemen?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Lukman. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Steve Bitner. I mean, we've heard over and over again from the US State Department that the Kurds are strategic partners, they're great friends. And in light of what happened in 2017 with the Kurdistan independence referendum, and of course that came as a result of deteriorating relations between Baghdad and Erbil.
Your question, please.
The question is, we see no clear evidence that you guys, the State Department, is doing anything to reconcile Baghdad and Erbil with regards to Article 140 of the Iraqi Constitution, the Peshmerga's share of the budget, Kurdistan's share of the national budget, and so many other issues. I mean, does this imply that you are anticipating another independence referendum for Kurdistan because you feel that relations between Hawlier and Baghdad have collapsed and an independent Kurdistan is forthcoming?
Thank you, Kaka. So, are the US engaged in trying to bring parties together? Make sense of what we are?
Yeah, I would say the United States values having a productive and cooperative relationship between Kurdistan region and Baghdad. And we have many, many conversations with folks to try to help bring that to realization.
Okay, I have a question for Vali. You have not been in Iraq for a while. For the last few days, you went to Najaf, had some discussions, workshops in Baghdad, and over the last day or so here in KRG. What are the key takeaways, high-level takeaways, in reflection of your writing, in reflection of your understanding of Iraq and the region, and primarily also from a Shia perspective? What are your key takeaways?
I mean, it's very clear talking to Iraqis that they still see the project of state formation in Iraq an ongoing process. And there is relief that finally there is a government, but also a recognition of the dangers that Iraq went through in the past year, including the showdown in the green zone, etc., what it means. But I think, particularly in Najaf, Karbala, in Baghdad, and even here in Erbil, looking at the dynamism of the society in Iraq, it brings to mind that we often talk all the time about governments and states, and we forget that societies are very important. I mean, we're seeing it also in Iran right now, or we saw it during Arab Spring, that societies may not be able to change the region, but they could be disruptors in some ways, or it could push the region in different ways. I mean, I think what I saw at the ground level in Iraq, in people, in the way, there's a blossoming, if you would, of social activity at the ground level among the youth that is actually a hopeful sign. There's a contrast between what you see in Iraqi society, or let's say what you see on the ground in Najaf and Karbala in terms of people, and what you see then in terms of what's happening at the government level or the regional level.
Okay, so you're nicely surprised?
I was nicely surprised. I mean, I do see a lot more hope, dynamism, engagement, forward movement, despite the paralyses and the complaints that they have about government. I mean, my sense very quickly in Baghdad, I mean, for a country that was occupied, went through a civil war, just a few years ago, 40% of its territory was occupied by Daesh and has had a year of very conflictual political relationship. I think the society itself is perhaps the good news in Iraq at many levels.
I think it would be appreciated if you can reflect in writing when you go back on this, because Iraqis want to view your view, because they haven't heard it for a while, and to that effect, I think it would be a nice gesture from you, and certainly will allow you to come back to enrich your reading of it. Could you make it 2 minutes between the question and the answer? Because we're running out of short. Please.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Jinjian Azadi. Thank you very much. I have 3 questions, actually, very short ones.
Your name?
Kag Vali. Oh, sorry, Tanya Gili Kailani.
Tanya.
The Kag Vali, my question to you is, through your crystal ball, do you think that the Iran agreement will be used as a card by the Iranians to put out the revolution in Iran? That's my question to you. Randa, you talked a lot about these new alliances and things like that, and I just wanted to understand, or from your perspective, do you think any of these new alliances that are taking place, that are not with America, are they actually going to create any kind of change within the status quo in the region? Is there going to be any changes? And to Steve, of course, I would like to ask you a question. As America actually mediated the maritime agreement between Lebanon and Israel, and that was successful. It was, it was an issue-based mediation, and it was a win-win to both sides. I was wondering if this is something that the Americans would actually think about doing, especially when it comes to climate change, and what is happening from Turkey in terms of cutting off the water supplies and how that is affecting the region.
3 minutes, 3 answers, 3 quick answers from each one of you.
So I think it's, at least for now, at this moment in time, it's the other way around. In other words, it's that what's happening inside Iran has basically closed the door for the negotiations to succeed. Not to say that they were going to happen, but because the opinion in the West has now become harder, more sanctions have been put on Iran, Western leaders don't want to be seen signing a deal with Iran. And I think Iran's internal priority among its rulers is right now national security. So I think it's the other way around. It's the protests that basically have created a situation that we cannot imagine this being signed in the near future.
Randa?
Quick answer, no, it won't change the status quo. In fact, these alliances are meant to preserve and strengthen the status quo. In fact, if there is one thing that most of the countries are united around in this part of the world, is regime preservation.
Stephen?
Short answer, yes. We want to work with countries across the region in order to share our expertise and develop solutions to mitigate the effects of climate change and water scarcity specifically.
Finally, let me thank everybody for your questions and my companion panelists for their answers. We look forward to the next session, and thank you very much.
Thank you.